I mean, like if you
Trying to
can,
put me out of a job, Chuck?
but I see, and people talk about that, right? Like, hey, we're going to lose all these jobs and whatnot, but I don't. Usually, that's not the case with these types of things.
Yeah.
Usually what happens is that that you find out that the man along with the tool is better than man by itself or tool by itself.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nasdaq Dorsey Wright podcast for the week ending on June 2nd. My name is Ian Saunders, and we're joined as well this week by Chuck Fuller. Chuck's a portfolio manager here with us at Dorsey Wright. He does a lot of stuff with the research team as well. I know he's kind of in depth with a lot of the research and strategy testing. So, Chuck, great to have you on this week.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It's been a while since I've done this. So yeah, I was looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's you've certainly still probably done more than I have in the past, even though it's been a little bit here.
Yeah,
So
yeah. 16 years will do that. So
exactly. But thanks for hopping on with us this for the first podcast in the month of June. So I mean, this week we saw the month of May wrap up for 2023. It was a pretty solid month of May for most of the or for many areas across the domestic equity space, but really the focus areas of strength that we saw. I mean, we've been continuing to hit on throughout our research, not the podcast. Over the past couple of weeks, Chuck, has been technology. I mean, we had interestingly enough, a little kind of tidbit for you. This past month of May was the best ever month of May for the Spider Sector Fund XLK for technology, up 8.92% during the month of May. So best ever May for XLK. But it's not even in the top two best performing months for XLK on a year-to-date basis. It's still
right.
third behind March, behind January. So, I mean, even though we saw a big outperformance from technology in May versus other areas, it's nothing new this year, right? I mean, this has been kind of a consistent theme that's been building up.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I mean, it partially, you got to remember how bad it was last year, right?
Right.
It's I don't think anybody's really forgotten that, but it's one thing you got to keep in mind. And and often off of kind of long-term bottoms, we see this kind of laggard rally where the stocks that did the worst previously start to do the best, and that seems to be what's going on here. And then plus you've got this whole kind of AI situation driving things up as well. So it's there's a kind of a technical aspect to it and maybe a fundamental aspect to it too, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the bulk of today's conversation, Chuck, we're going to dive into the AI theme, right? As if there's not enough conversation about their AI,
Right.
we figured we'd kind of add a little bit to the conversation, especially kind of pick your brain on some insights there. I mean, technology moved back into that number one spot in Dolly back in mid-May. It's set ninth in February. So just that pop from up 7 spots in just a few months. I mean, AI was driving a lot of that improvement. I mean, you saw interest rising rapidly across many different companies and in a lot of areas kind of over the earnings calls at the end of the first quarter, just showing a massive spike in conversations generally about AI.
Yeah. It's been really interesting to see. Obviously, a lot of this comes on the heels of OpenAI releasing ChatGPT back, I think it was in November. That kind of has taken the world by storm. And I'd say rightly so. I mean, it's really interesting technology. We were talking about it, before we started the podcast, how, I mean, I kind of feel like it's maybe one of the cooler things I've seen since at least like the first iPhone and maybe the internet in general. I know that sounds like hype in and of itself, but I mean, the more you use it, I find myself, using it, more or less every day, not for, let's say major aspects of what I'm doing. But I'm using it here and there, with to do little things that need to get done. To me, it's only going to get more and more involved in everyone's work, right? You're
Yeah.
going to use it more and more as these things become more capable. And so it's interesting, but there's been a lot of different themes and fads, whether it's Bitcoin or whatever. There's all kinds of these things that have happened over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years. And I think people rightly are asking themselves, okay, is this just another flash in the pan, or is this something that's going to stay around for a while?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Before, I mean, on you kind of, so just the general take on it. So I'm hearing you right. You don't think AI is gonna end the world Is that the?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but no, I mean, there's actually a lot of people who are worried about that, right? And the idea about that seems like crazy to the average person. Like, okay, how's this going to end the world? That's crazy hype. And the thing about it is, if it actually becomes more intelligent than the average human, which is what a lot of people are saying is going to happen, and maybe in the shorter term versus the longer term. If that happens, I mean, it's hard to even imagine what that looks like, because you have to start thinking about how, are we ants compared to it, and what would we do to an ant? Well, we might step on it and not even think twice.
You might not.
Right. And, so that's the thing, what will a super intelligence, do to us? And there's a lot of people who think that once it gets to that point, it'll treat us like ants and it won't care. And there's some pretty prominent names who think that. There's actually a guy at Google named Jeffrey Hinton. He's been a big AI guy for a long time. He actually just quit Google so that he could tell people more about these worries that he has without kind of the conflict of interest of working with Google. But then there's people on the other side who are, just as prominent, who say the opposite, who say this is crazy. We're not going to have, any kind of super intelligence for decades. Why give up the benefits that AI can give us, the kind of the pre-super intelligence benefits.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not often that you play with something and you can immediately see how powerful it is, right? I mean, it's an immediate reaction of, like other fads you're talking about, like Bitcoin. It sounds nice. It sounds like a lot of things it could improve, but I mean, it's just fun to play with on the more of the AI ChatGPT.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's fun to play with, and I mean, it can do some powerful things right now. Right out of the box. You can use it to help you code if you're a programmer. I've used it in that capacity some, where this was just like a couple weeks ago. I needed to have a spreadsheet send an email out. And okay, I could figure that out, right? I could go, get on Google or, go to Stack Overflow or any number of these websites and try to figure out how to write that code. And I was like, well, let me just ask ChatGPT, and I just asked it in English, hey, I got this spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. I needed to send out an email, process the data in the spreadsheet and then send it out in an email. Write the code for me. And in 30 seconds, I wrote the code. And I pasted it in and it worked. You know what I mean? I mean, it's crazy. I'd never seen anything like that. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that I didn't think, would be around for a long time from now. And yet here it is. Right.
You talk about, and you and I were talking before about AI. I mean, AI is it's a big name that's grown a lot in popularity over the past 6 months, right? Or since October, I think, when ChatGPT launched. Yeah. But it's not a new term. I mean, it's been around for years. I mean, just kind of different iterations of it that have changed, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, I got a computer science degree, over 20 years ago. And, I took artificial intelligence back then. It was old back then. Right. If you look at the history of it, it's been around since basically like the 1950s. And what happens is it has gone through multiple hype cycles over time. Back in the 50s, when they first started, formulating these ideas, everybody who was working on at the time thought that, we're going to be in the Jetsons, by like the mid 60s, right? They didn't think it was going to take any time. Of course, that didn't pan out, right? It was so much hype happened then. And then, of course, you went into a period where everybody got, disillusioned. And that lasted for a while. I think that lasted through, most of the 60s and the 70s. And then in the 1980s, you had kind of another hype period, which is they rediscovered these things that they called neural networks, which is basically just a fancy way of saying, we're kind of mimicking the way that the brain works in software.
And that was in the 80s?
That was in the 80s, yeah. Yeah, really, neural networks go back to the 50s. It's just they just had unsophisticated ways of doing it. We just got more sophisticated, in creating these things over time. but yeah, in the 80s, they, basically discovered this algorithm called backpropagation that, moved the field forward. And it was another, hype cycle, right? Everybody thought, oh, by the 90s, we'll be all, crazy. We'll be like the Jetsons and whatnot. And of course, that didn't pan out either. And so you went through another period of disillusionment. And that lasted, I'd say most of the 90s and into the 2000s. And really, it was probably the early 20 teens when things started to take off again. And that kind of, precedes this whole GPT period. But a lot of the work that went into making ChatGPT what it is was kind of formulated in the last 10 years or so. It kind of started off, you may have heard of like the term deep learning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Basically, deep learning is just another way of taking neural networks and expanding what they can do. Basically, I remember back in the when I was learning, I learned about neural networks, and basically it was the type of thing where you have like what they call an input layer, an output layer, and you have this thing called a hidden layer. When I say layers, all these things are is just think of it as layers of neurons, but neurons in software, right? Neurons being brain cells. So you had like an input layer where you feed stuff in, you had an output layer where you get the answer, and you have this hidden layer in between neurons that kind of bridges the two. But back then it was the idea was, well, you can't have multiple hidden layers. In other words, multiple of these middle layers, they don't really add anything. It's kind of law of diminishing returns. But in the early 20 teens, it's actually this Jeffrey Hinton guy that I talked about earlier. He had a group called DeepMind, which Google ended up buying. And they really ratcheted it up, in terms of what these things could do. I think there was some kind of like image competition where an AI tries to figure out like, hey, what's in these pictures, right? It'll like the humans will label them, like they'll label the pictures. Hey, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a car, or whatever. But you try to have the AI figure out what it is, right? And his group, like their performance this one year, I forget what year it was, like 2012 or something, was so far and above like what everybody else had been doing that it caught everybody's attention, right? And basically like, made this whole deep learning craze start. And basically the idea is that he figured out how to increase the number of layers in between in the neural network and make it work, that you actually got more value out of it, instead of having the kind of law of diminishing returns hit it. So that was a big deal at the time. And, so really, I mean, AI has kind of been in a I guess you'd say it's AI summer, right? Instead of winter, right? Like it's been in an AI summer mode for most of the last 10 years.
And so you combine that with like the level of the computing power that we get now, right? I mean, you're just able to exponentially increase that.
That's exactly right. So I think that's the other part of it too, is like, okay, you go back to the 50s. Yeah. Okay. They had a neural network, right? But they didn't have any data, right? Like no data. The data was so expensive back then. And even in the 80s, when they had the next kind of AI summer craze, they still didn't have, anywhere near the data that they needed to really do something meaningful, right? And I think that's why it's taken so long, is that the cost of data, number one, data generation and data storage, costs of all those things had to plummet to the levels, that they were around the beginning of the 20 teens for these fads, I shouldn't call it fad, but these kind of trends to take off, right?
Right.
And so, and then of course, you fast forward 10 years and you got ChatGPT. But what's interesting there is that Google created the architecture behind ChatGPT like 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Back in 2017, it's called like the transformer architecture for neural networks. And they created it, back then, but you would think, well, why didn't they come out with ChatGPT like right away? Right. And the problem, the reason why they didn't, and I understand why they didn't, is because these things tend to hallucinate, right? If they don't know the answer exactly, they're going to give you an answer regardless.
Mm-hmm.
They're working on changing that and making that better. But there are definitely still times where you ask it something and it just makes up something. right?
Right.
And I think they saw that, when they made this, that, hey, it does incredibly well on certain tasks, but then it hallucinates on other tasks. And you got to figure with think about 2017 and all the things that were going on at that time with fake news and all kinds of just misinformation about all kinds of different things, right? I think they were maybe rightly so, afraid to put that out, right? Even though it was, transformational. And then
so
I
sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go.
I was going to say, so you think about this as it's not necessarily a fad because it's been around since the 50s, right? It's just continued to come in different kind of waves. And this last wave seems to be exponentially moving higher and higher and higher. So, I mean, does that mean it's not a fad or just a theme? I mean, how kind of pervasive do you see it being across like our general lives? And I mean, especially like the financial marketplace. I mean, that's one place that I've tried asking ChatGPT about financial returns, and it won't give me much information there. So
right. Yeah. So I think to answer the question, over the long term, it's absolutely not a fad, right? Like you go forward 50 years from now, there is no way that AI isn't, doing so much more than what we can even imagine right now. But the short term is what you got to figure out. Are we still in kind of one of these like intermediate cycles, before we get the final thing? I think that could be the case, but I will say that each one of these kind of in between cycles before you get to super intelligence or whatever, has been transformational in maybe ways that you couldn't see necessarily. This might be one of the first ones where, hey, your average consumer can actually see that this is transformational. But even back in the 80s, it's not that the things that they created back then weren't used, right? Like they were used. It's just, more behind the scenes kind of things that you just might not realize. And so, but yeah, I would say this is the first time that we've had a real like consumer oriented AI app that can really make a difference in the average person's life. And so in that sense, I don't think it's a fad, even over the short term. I think that there's going to be definitely ways that these large language models can be integrated into lots of different things. Number one, they're just going to keep getting better, right? So like, actually, I saw something a couple of days ago where just talking about this hallucination issue that they have. And they were looking at the first version of ChatGPT, which they consider like version 3.5. And then they compared it to ChatGPT 4, which is the kind of the newest version. Just between those two versions, the amount of hallucination dropped by 90%. Right.
Wow.
So, I mean, they're already doing like incredible work to bring that down. I can already tell. I've got ChatGPT 4 on my phone, and to me, it's like it's night and day. Like whereas before, like on the first version, I remember I asked it about, I forget what it was. It showed me some research papers on a certain subject, right? And it dutifully gave me a list of 5 or 6 papers, and I'm looking at the list. I was like, man, I've never heard of this first one. That's kind of interesting. I clicked on it, or actually no, I had to Google it. I Googled it, and this paper doesn't exist. This is nowhere to be found. It just made it up, right?
Wow.
But the tricky part is that some of the other ones in the list that it gave me were legitimate papers, right? And then I did something recently with ChatGPT 4 where I asked it kind of a similar thing, and it didn't do that at all. It gave me all kind of legitimate answers and that type of thing. So it is improving. So fast it's kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, and I mean that's where you've gotten some of the investors trying to take advantage of some of that improvement, right? Through a lot of these companies like Microsoft, you mentioned about AI, I mentioned Google a lot. I've seen a lot of investment flowing into those companies over the course of the past few weeks. And then you got something like NVIDIA that comes out last week, mentions AI 50 times, I think, on their earnings call, and the stock is up 23% on a trailing 7-day basis and 30% over a trailing 30 days.
Right. They just hit $1 trillion in market cap too. I mean,
it's insane, right?
Unbelievable. Yeah, and then what's interesting about that too is that what people don't realize is that a lot of these AIs, they need to be trained. It's almost like a baby, that you got to train up before they become an adult and become productive members of society, right? So you have to train these AIs, and believe it or not, like, so with computers, you typically think of like the processor in the computer, otherwise known as the CPU, right? For training these things, it's actually not really efficient to use like the CPU in the computer. It's more efficient to use a GPU, which is a graphics processor unit, and that's what NVIDIA makes, right? They're the GPU kings, and so
and
all
I've
these.
heard, I mean, that's because of it's able to process multiple different things at once instead of just one give and take, right?
It's massively
but those chips
parallel.
are like what, $10,000 a chip or something
They
like
can
that?
be, right? Yeah, I mean, so like, yeah, some of the really high power ones that you're going to find in AWS or like Microsoft Azure or whatever. Yeah, they're they're ridiculously expensive, but also ridiculously powerful, right? And that's why these guys they have to use them. And I don't know that there's an end in sight. That's what's kind of interesting for NVIDIA. Like all of a sudden that day that they came out with earnings, it jumped up 30% or whatever it was. And I guess that's people kind of recalibrating what the future cash flows are going to be, right?
Right.
But who knows what it's going to be, right? Like that's just people's one day estimate. Going forward in time. The thing about this stuff is that it could be exponential in terms of how it takes off from here. And yeah, I mean, even though it's up so much and it's overbought and all these different things, I mean, it could have a lot more upside potentially.
Yeah. And I mean, you're looking at it is heavily overbought, right? 134% overbought, up almost 160% year to date with market movement. That's including yesterday's 5 or 6% drop. Right. And then you look at other names, Chuck, I know you and I were touching on some other names. I mean, you got the broader like Global X Robotics and Art AI ETF, BOTZ. It's up almost 33% year to date prior to today's move. But then you get something like Meta that's up 120% year to date. I mean, that's not necessarily something you immediately, when I think AI, I don't necessarily think Meta or Facebook, right?
Right.
But
yeah.
It's paid off, and
they have a huge AI group. But yeah, you're right. You tend to think of Google, you tend to think of Microsoft with their partnership with OpenAI. But yeah, Meta is interesting in this respect. They're doing things seemingly a little bit differently. I think they're a little bit more open source friendly, even though they're the competitors OpenAI. That's what's one thing that's kind of interesting is OpenAI was kind of created to be an open source alternative to all these big tech companies kind of dominating AI and making it closed source. But I think they found that the costs of training these things is so high, they had to partner with one of the big companies, which Microsoft, and is kind of seemingly changed their mandate of being open source. But what's interesting is with Meta. Is that there was a leak of one of their big large language models, so kind of a leak of their version of ChatGPT, and so all these like open source programmers and researchers, basically took that and been running with it, and making all kinds of things with it. And what's interesting is because fundamentally this is Meta's model, they get to benefit from all these thousands of people working on their platform. And I can't say that that's why it's up 120%, but I bet you it's part of it, right? Is they've got so many people kind of helping them out in the open source community that, sky's the limit for them.
Yeah. And I mean, you look at something like that's up 120% year to date. And it's still $70 away from its 2022 high. Right. I mean, it came in at 20. It just showed, I mean, like you were talking about at the beginning with technology, it fell so far. Climbing back up. Meta is just kind of almost a poster child for that, even though it's not technically in the technology space. It's just it's up a lot, but it's still has, I mean, room to run to where at least get back to where it's been before.
Yeah, exactly. And really, I mean, that's kind of the whole Nasdaq 100, as a whole. We talked about some other things, but yeah, NDX is up, over 30% this year. It's up over its August highs. And starting to challenge its kind of, what was it, the March highs? I kind of don't even remember the March highs. They seem like so long ago. And they were a year ago, but it just seems like forever that we were back at those levels, right?
Right.
So I
This
mean,
past year has definitely felt like more than a year.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's creeping up there, and I don't know. With every move that it makes up, it makes me think, man. I mean, maybe this is the bull, right? This isn't the bear market rally. This could be the bull, right?
Yeah. I mean,
So, cross your
let's hope,
fingers.
hope AI, that wave of AI continues to turn the bear back into a bull.
Exactly. Right.
I mean, we're looking at it now. It's still a little bit, we're still seeing a lot of these names that are in overbought territory. But so like you said, Chuck, you might expect some kind of maybe some near term back off. But I mean, from a longer term perspective, seems like some of the stuff at least has some staying power. So
I mean, yeah, that's what it seems. So.
Right. And yeah, we'll definitely do our best to continue to reach out. Those that are subscribers to the platform, if you have any questions about any of these particular names that we're looking at and kind of the technical posture, the overbought, oversold areas, definitely feel free to reach out to us here at Dorsey Wright. Chuck, anything else with kind of AI or anything else that you wanted to hit on for today?
No, I think I'm good.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for hopping on here with us this week for this first podcast here in June. Thanks to all the listeners for tuning in this week as well. We'll be back to talk with you next week.